all glad to have you here. And I think many, if not all of you, already know Maxine Sheets-Johnstone. She's a 30-year resident of YAAS, and pardon my neglect, but I left my notes at home, Maxine, but I think I can do this anyway. So, Maxine is a very highly educated woman, and she's lived here for 30 years after retiring. She has a bachelor's degree in comparative literature, and a master's degree in dance, and a PhD in philosophy and dance. And she also has an incomplete PhD in zoology, I believe. Evolutionary biology, okay. She's the author of at least 11 books. I heard somebody say 17 as they came in the door, but 11 is correct. And I think she's going to give a very dynamic talk about emotions and movement. But before we do that, I need to mention that next month's program, which is on the 4th Sunday, instead of the 3rd, as this one is also on the 4th, will be here. And it's about LiDAR on steroids. And if you don't know what LiDAR is, which I didn't know either, it's, Adam, help me out.
Laser imaging, something. Lasers.
It's radar with lasers.
Radar and lasers, and looking at the Earth and under the ocean and stuff like that. So it should be very interesting. All right, Maxine, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. And to thank the YAAS Arts and Sciences Society for inviting me. It was a great pleasure to hear of the invitation and to be able to accept it. That was just very, very, very nice. I'd like to begin, actually, by acknowledging 3 researchers and writers, each from a different academic area. One is evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin, one is by psychoanalyst Carl Jung, and one is phenomenological philosopher Edmund Husserl. Each of these men, from quite different perspectives, sheds light on emotions and movement, and each has influenced my research and writing over many, many years. Each of these men, in one way or another, put aside their beliefs and their opinions and the writings of their colleagues who have various theories, and so on, and then explore and examine the subjects of their inquiry from a fresh perspective. In doing so, they do what Husserl described as making the familiar strange. In other words, starting anew. In other words, they approach the subject of the inquiry as if for the first time. The results of their inquiries were thus all anchored in real life, real-time experience, the experience of the world, as in Darwin's explorations of all forms of animate life in his worldwide journeys. The experience of the human psyche, as in Jung's explorations of the collective unconscious and the archetypal forms of human thought and feeling. The experience of both ourselves and the world, as in Husserl's explorations of what he termed the twofold articulation of movement and perception in our daily lives and in our learning to navigate the world in the first place as infants. Darwin is most notably known for his Origin of Species, as well he should be, but he wrote other books that are equally insightful and penetratingly descriptive. He wrote The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, with observations on their habits. He wrote The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. He wrote The Voyage of the Beagle, in which he described his 5-year journey aboard ship around the world, book that anchored The Origin of Species. And he wrote a book that is absolutely critical to understanding emotions and movement, namely the expression of emotions in man and animals. And that's this book here. If any of you are interested in looking at it afterwards, you're very free to do so. It has my little writings here and there in it, but it's just fine to look through if you'd like to. In his summary at the end of this book, Darwin leaves us with probing thoughts and considerations. For example, he writes, quote, "It is perhaps worth consideration whether movements at first used only by one or only a few individuals to express a certain state of mind may not sometimes have spread to others and ultimately have become universal through the power of conscious and unconscious imitation." He says that there exists in man a strong tendency to imitation, independently of the conscious will, and that is certain. He writes specifically that there is difficulty, or rather no difficulty, in recognizing that when a female quadruped, that means a four-legged animal, first bears young, she knows the cry of distress of her offspring, and that in admitting that man and animals instinctively recognize and fear their enemies, and of both these statements he says there can be no reasonable doubt. And then he goes on to say, and this is all a quote, "It is, however, extremely difficult to prove that our children instinctively recognize an expression. I attended to this point in my firstborn infant, who could not have learned anything by associating with other children, and I was convinced that he understood a smile and received pleasure from seeing one, answering it by another, at much too early an age to have learned anything by experience. When this child was about 4 months old, I made in his presence many odd noises and strange grimaces, and tried to look savage. But the noises, if not too loud, as well as the grimaces, were all taken as good jokes. And I attributed this at the time to their being preceded or accompanied by smiles." Unquote. He furthermore notes, "It has often struck me as a curious fact that so many shades of expression are instantly recognized without any conscious process of analysis on one's part. No one, I believe, can clearly describe a sullen or sly expression. Yet many observers are unanimous that these expressions can be recognized in the various races of man." He cites laughter as an example. "We may confidently believe that laughter as a sign of pleasure or enjoyment was practiced by our progenitors long before they deserved to be called human. For very many kinds of monkeys, when pleased, utter a reiterated sound, clearly analogous to our laughter, often accompanied by vibratory movements of their jaws or lips, with the corners of their mouths drawn backwards and upwards, by the wrinkling of the cheeks, and even by the brightening of their eyes. We may likewise infer that fear was expressed in almost the same manner as it is now by man, namely by trembling, the erection of the hair, cold perspiration, pallor, widely open eyes, relaxation of most of the muscles, and by the whole body cowering downward or held motionless." Darwin goes on to describe the animated nature of suffering, rage, and anger across animal species. In short, throughout the book, Darwin describes how emotions move through the bodies of both human and non-human animals and move them to move. At the end of the talk, I'm going to show some pictures that are taken from the expression of the emotions in man and animals. Jung's psychological observations on emotions expand on Darwin's evolutionary observations in a particularly important way when he focuses on the fact that we do not choose our feelings. We choose only if and how we act on them. He succinctly points out, quote, affects are not made or willfully produced, they simply happen. Before proceeding with a discussion of the fact that affects are not made or willfully produced, they simply happen, I would like to share some biographical facts about Jung that illuminate his keen ability to describe emotional experience, particularly his emotional experience of another human, in this case, Adolf Hitler. Jung, this is all a quote, Jung saw Hitler in person at a rally and described him as follows. When I saw him with my own eyes, he suggested a psychic scarecrow with a broomstick for an outstretched arm, rather than a human being. In other words, as a psychic scarecrow rather than a human being. It is also difficult to understand how his ranting speeches delivered in shrill, grating tones could have made such an impression. It is not without misgivings that one ventures to pin the label of psychopathic inferiority onto a whole nation, and yet heaven knows it is the only explanation which could in any way account for the effect of this scarecrow on the masses. A sorry lack of education, conceit that borders on madness, a very mediocre intelligence, combined with the hysterics, cunning, and power fantasies of an adolescent, were written all over this demagogue's face. These personal observations led me to conclude at the time, this was in 1937 for Jung, that when the final catastrophe came, it would be far greater and bloodier than I had previously supposed, unquote. In an article titled A Jungian Perspective on the Unity of Mind and Body and its Relevance to 21st Century Politics, it was published in Psychotherapy and Politics International, I began by putting basic Jungian themes in the context of present-day conceptual predilections that warrant questioning, specifically in relation to feeling and to being a body. The questioning led to insights into the dynamic congruency of emotions and movement, into the political reality of human demonstrations, protests, marches, and so on, and from there to Jung's notion of a psychic, what he calls a psychic epidemic, an epidemic that takes hold by way of a totalitarian mass state, a notion that appears, it seems to me, ominously present in today's world. As both effectively and kinesthetically experienced, emotions are clearly dynamic in highly distinctive ways. Anger, disgust, sadness, disappointment move through us and move us to move in distinctive ways. And those ways are different from the ways we move when we are joyous or curious, for example. Emotions move us to move in dynamically distinctive ways. Oddly enough, the foundational dynamic congruency of emotions and movement go largely unrecognized, so much so that the relationship remains unacknowledged as a basic fact of animate life. The oversight is surprising, given that Darwin's writings on the emotions of man and animals offers ample testimony to the fact. The basic fact is furthermore clearly apparent in everyday human life, from human infancy onward, to anyone who would observe and reflect. The oversight in acknowledging the relationship may in fact explain why people speak of political movements that foster protests, marches, demonstrations, walkouts, and so on, fail to connect those movements to their generative sources in feelings, or if they do, they fail to see the foundational significance of that relationship and its motivational genesis in bodily felt dynamics. Precisely in real life, real-time feelings, whether of anger, dissatisfaction, resentment, offense, or simple outrage. Clearly, the foundational relationship between emotions and movement warrants acknowledgement as the existential truth it is. Now, however valid or questionable one finds Jung's linking of emotions to the collective unconscious, what he calls the collective unconscious, that is, a consciousness that is the same across all humans. And however valid or questionable one finds his description of emotions as, quote, elemental outbursts intruding on, quote, the rational order of consciousness, unquote. His comments on the autonomy of the unconscious and its integral relationship to emotions are of decided import. They are in fact pointedly relevant to understandings not only of human individuals, whether normal or pathologically disturbed, but understandings of groups of individuals and of national politics. Consider the following comments Jung makes in relation to the human mind. This is a quote. Nothing produced by the human mind lies absolutely apart from the psychic realm. Even the craziest idea must correspond to something in the psyche. We cannot suppose that certain minds contain elements that do not exist at all in other minds, nor can we assume that the unconscious is capable of becoming autonomous only in certain people, namely in those predisposed to insanity. It is very much more likely that the tendency to autonomy is a more or less general peculiarity of the unconscious. This tendency shows itself above all in affective states, in other words, in emotions, including those of normal people. When in a state of violent affect, one says or does things which exceed the ordinary. Not much is needed. Love and hate, joy and grief are often enough to make the ego and the unconscious change places. Very strange ideas can indeed take possession of otherwise healthy people on such occasions. Groups, communities, and even whole nations can be seized in this way by psychic epidemics. Jung's keenly descriptive term, psychic epidemics, and his insight into a connection between very strange ideas in individuals and very strange ideas in groups, communities, and even whole nations are acutely perceptive and warrant detailed examination. Jung lucidly describes psychic epidemics in a book titled Civilizations in Transition, and I brought this book too, just in case anybody wants to riffle through it. It's a huge book, and it's really very, very much worth looking at and reading. Various chapters are just quite insightful about humans. Anybody wants to look at that. Four chapters of the book have substantive ties to Nazi Germany, but the descriptions therein are directly applicable to today's political world and its center stage-seeking politicians, namely Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping. Indeed, the chapters offer striking observations that illuminate today's political turmoils and their complex psychophysiological origins. Not physiological, pathological, psychopathological origins. In effect, Jung's descriptions and insights are not futuristic, clairvoyant prognostications of 21st century human politics. He died, after all, sometime before. But the uncanny discernments of what may well be designated foundational human affective dispositions and foundational human dispositions to do, to act, to move in certain ways. The dual dispositions substantively authenticate Jung's psychology of archetypes and the behaviors those archetypes engender. Indeed, one could with good reason insist that chapters in Civilization in Transition be required reading for anyone wanting to gain sound understandings of psychic epidemics and the motivational and actional character of particular 21st century politicians, namely those seeking power über alles, that means over everyone, and who are in truth and in a psychopathological sense, what I've called self-addicted. The mythical German god Wotan, whom Jung describes as the god of storm and frenzy, the unleasher of passions and the lust for battle, is the archetypal figure whom Jung singles out in this context and who anchors these understandings. Wotan unleashes passions in others who join in his lust for battle. In short, emotions are clearly active in psychic epidemics and clearly do impel individuals towards certain actions. Emotions thus do indeed happen to us, but how we move, how we act in relation to them, whether in everyday life or even in psychic epidemics, remains a choice. That freedom of choice actually includes our ability to feign an emotion or repress an emotion, as when we smile at someone we don't really care for, or when we refuse to acknowledge that we are really angry and annoyed and raise our arms in a certain way and say something like, "Oh no, that's fine." We should note, however, that freedom of choice is blocked, nullified by a well-known pan-animate reflex, namely the startle reflex, the bodily movements of which are recognizable across species. They were described in detail more than 75 years ago by psychologists Carney Landis and William Hunt, affiliated respectively with the New York Psychiatric Institute and Hospital and with Connecticut College. Landis and Hunt observed and filmed the responses of an really extraordinarily broad range of subjects to the unexpected sound of a pistol shot. They filmed subjects from human infants to human adults, from non-human primates and other animals to reptiles and amphibia, that means to toads and frogs and salamander, and from officers of the New York City Police Department to schizophrenics, manic depressives, feeble-minded persons, epileptics, and other afflicted hospitalized persons. Their research thus included not just normal humans, but pathologically disturbed humans and non-human animals. In their book, The Startle Pattern, Landis and Hunt describe a basic movement pattern across all subjects, that means non-human as well as human, a general bodily flexion, that means, which resembles a protective contraction or shrinking of the individual. But they also describe the pattern in humans in detail. blinking of the eyes, head movement forward, a characteristic facial expression, raising and drawing forward of the shoulders, abduction of the upper arms, bending of the elbows, pronation of the lower arms, flexion of the fingers, forward movement of the trunk, contraction of the abdomen, and bending of the knees. Moreover, they note specifically that the response is very rapid and follows sudden, intense stimulation, and that the basic reaction is not amenable to voluntary control and is universal. Of particular interest, too, is their comparison of the English word startle that captures the temporal suddenness of the movement. The individual who is startled jumps or starts, and the German word Zusammenfahren, the individual who shrinks or shrivels. While the suddenness of the reflex testifies to the possibility of imminent danger, the shriveling or shrinking testifies to possible harm and to a protective move against that possible harm. What is learned from Landis and Hunt's extensive research is that the startle reflex is a complex archetypal bodily response, a phylogenetic, that means across species, kinetic, affective, animate reality, generated automatically as a protective reaction to something jarring, out of the ordinary, and unexpected. As an immediate but not enduring bodily reaction to something sudden and possible harm, the startle reflex, they point out, is a temporal microcosm of trauma. What the startle reflex offers us is a basic and, in fact, pan-animate insight into the fact that, as Jung points out and emphasizes, emotions simply happen to us. This insight, especially in Carney and Hunt's description of the total bodily movement pattern of startle, offers us a path to extended insights into the intrinsic relationship of emotions and movement. Consider, for example, infant psychiatrist and clinical psychologist George Downing, who questions emotions, namely, should our focus be on the face or on the body as a whole? When Downing attempts to show how, quote, research strategies limited to the face while having had considerable success may marginalize phenomena that in fact are deserving of more attention, unquote, he surely points us in the direction of reconsidering not just a limited body view of emotion, but a view that is developmentally disjoint. That is, if, as Downing notes, effectively speaking, infants would seem to be full-body creatures from the start. We may ask how it is that adult humans commonly lose not sight of, but the felt bodily sense of their full bodily feelings. Losing touch with their emotions in this experiential sense, adult humans thereby commonly fail to recognize the dynamics of emotion, conceiving emotions as states of being or as nothing more than discrete bodily sensations. Indeed, today's investigative research on emotion is very commonly brain-tethered. The liability of focusing exclusive attention on the brain, in many instances the elevated human one, of course, in the absence of a whole-body nervous system often leads to near laughable claims. In particular, in many instances, including high-profile ones, experiential ascriptions are made to brains and by famous neuroscientists. We read, for example, if you see the back of a person's head, the brain infers there's a face on the front of it. Well, I think that's terribly funny. we read, in my view, that's actually written by Crick, of the co-discoverer of DNA, and Christopher Koch, which is interesting. We read, in my view, emotional feelings represent only one category of affects that brains experience. In other words, that brains experience your emotions, and that's by a very well-known neuroscientist, Jaak Panksepp. Maybe some of you have heard of. Then we read, an object's image varies with distance, yet the brain can ascertain its true size. An older experiential description made in 1975 is significant in succinctly epitomizing the broader than human liabilities of living in a brain-tethered world. We read, non-human animals have brains capable of cooperative hunting, as if brains are out there hunting in concert on the savannah and cooperating with one another. Brains necessarily feel trust and confidence in each other. Perhaps the most outlandish, if not egregious, experiential description of all is a teaching company advertisement on behalf of a course taught by a neuroscientist. The course, titled How Your Brain Works, reads as follows, quote, everything you hear, feel, see, and think is controlled by your brain. It allows you to cope masterfully with your everyday environment and is capable of producing breathtaking athletic feats, sublime works of art, and profound scientific insights. But its most amazing achievement may be that it can understand itself. As famed neuropsychologist Alexander Romanovich Luria shows in finely detailed neurological and experiential detail, kinesthesia has to do with muscular innervations and denervations which allow both the smooth flow of movement and the attainment of what he calls complex sequential activities, such as writing one's name and calculating a sum, attainments that Luria aptly terms kinesthetic melodies. We do not have to wait for something to go wrong, as received wisdom dictates, in order to become aware of our everyday kinesthetic melodies. We have direct lines, kinesthesia and kinesthetic memory, to those dynamic patterns that constitute our everyday lives because we have precisely learned them and experienced them in the process of learning. In our everyday lives, kinesthetic melodies are commonly tied to affective melodies, as when we are hesitant or joyful, sad, curious, or disturbed. We have already seen through Darwin's eyes how the expression of emotions is tied to movement. But we also have essential insights into kinesthesia, our basic sense of movement from birth onward, a sense that we might well note is passed over when we speak of our five senses: hearing, sight, taste, touch, and smell. We have indeed forgotten our sense of movement. Husserl writes at length of kinesthesia as voluntary movement that is felt as a dynamic, animated flow. In this context, he points out that, quote, man in his movements, in his actions, in his speaking and writing, etc., is not a mere connection or linking up of one thing called a soul with another thing, the body. The body is, as body, filled with soul through and through. Each movement of the body is full of soul, the coming and going, the standing and sitting, the walking and dancing. Likewise is so every performance and every human production. I should clarify perhaps that what Husserl designates as soul is the psyche and is not, or the psychological aspects of being, and he's not talking about religion at all. In short, what is often divided in neuroscience research, emotions being states of mind or states of the brain, is not an embodied mind, but a mindful body. The affective and the kinetic are dynamically congruent dimensions of animate forms of life, whether they are crying out in distress, whether they are jumping for joy, or whether they are sitting and waiting patiently for someone to arrive. Finally, we may ask how we know when someone is sad or hesitant or joyful. How do we know that? We know that through their movements and gestures, their expressions. We recognize their movement, gestures, and expressions because we ourselves move in such way when we are sad or hesitant or joyful. We recognize the qualitative dynamics of movement and their congruency with certain emotions. Motion and emotion, kinetic and affective bodies are of a dynamic piece in non-human as well as human forms of animate life. A finely detailed description by two evolutionary biologists demonstrates this fact. The description is one of many possible examples from natural history that strikingly pinpoints the relationship between particular leaders and their followers. Particular leaders and their followers are described by Jung as Erbriefer, the one who seizes, and Erbriefener, those who are seized. Erbriefeners, he says, are males who, with their executive power, autocratically dominate the thoughts, beliefs, and actions of those in their society in whatever ways necessary to perpetuate their power and even increase the extent of their power. Jung states that they are like an incorrigible sponge that wants to soak up more, and pointedly describes them as akin to Wotan, the god who, as we saw earlier, is the god of storm and frenzy, the unleasher of passions and the lust for battle. Jung later characterizes Erbriefers as hysterics, that is, as suffering from pseudologia fantastica, a form of hysteria which is characterized by a peculiar talent for believing one's own lies. We can, of course, readily recognize their griefers in today's political world along with their followers, or disciples as we might call them, just as we can recognize them in the following description. And this is the one from natural history. There is no mistaking a dominant male macaque, that's a form of monkey, a species of monkey. These are superbly muscled monkeys. Their hair is sleek and carefully groomed. Their walk calm, assured, and majestic. They move in apparent disregard of lesser monkeys who scatter at their approach. For to obstruct the path of a dominant male, or even to venture when unwelcome, too near to him is an act of defiance, and macaques learn young that such a challenge will draw a heavy punishment. A dominant animal controls the space around it. It can invade an inferior space as a right, whereas no inferior would dare to venture into its space without first making a gesture of appeasement. On being threatened by a definitely dominant monkey, a subordinate is likely to display submission. Confronted with a fixed stare, it will look away. Faced with a possible charge, it is likely to crouch close to the ground, its head turned away. And if it flees and is chased, it will cringe away from the threatened bite or try to avoid punishment by presenting its hind quarters. Humans who are fearful of disobeying their superior don't at any time or in any way present their hindquarters when faced with possible harm from their superior, though perhaps doing so would allow everyone to see firsthand the the emotional backdrop that sustains the dominant-disciple relationship, a relationship that doesn't just obtain between autocratic dominant males and their followers, but definitely sustains the ongoing power of the autocratic dominant male. The congruency of emotion and motion is, of course, readily apparent not just in dominant-disciple relationships, but across a range of human situations. It comes to the fore immediately, for example, in situations in which humans rush to save others from imminent danger or possible harm, not only saving them from a burning fire or from falling down, but from being killed by gunmen, as exemplified by teachers and students themselves who put their own lives on the line to save other students from being shot. We can thus appreciate, again, how emotions move us to move, and that apart from reflex reactions, we are free to choose if and how we move. Such freedom, furthermore, allows us to inquire, for example, to explore, to doubt, to question, and so on, before moving in any way. In other words, though emotions move us to move, we are free to acknowledge and accept precisely what we are feeling and inclined to do, and then choose to act differently, responding thoughtfully, moving in ways that might in fact allow us to move together in ways that supersede ongoing dissonances, discords, and even violence. A definitely challenging path, but one that surely warrants consideration. Dissonances and discords notwithstanding, for instance, we might well learn new aspects of a situation from others with whom we strongly disagree, and even find that we have values in common. The ability to listen to others allows our emotions toward those others to open, and thus opens the possibility of ultimately moving together harmoniously toward a shared end. An overly optimistic attitude, perhaps, but surely one worthy of consideration. I'm going to show you some pictures now from Darwin's The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, and some from Jane Goodall's In the Shadow of Man and Through a Window Darkly, My 30 Years with Chimpanzees of Gandhi.
Startle reflex. Startle reflex.
Okay, this first one, as you can,
Yep, put your microphone
the
back
top
on.
one says,
Maxine,
Maybe you just
put your microphone back on.
just talk into this.
the first one, I don't know if you can read it, is a monkey in a placid condition, and the same one actually who is pleased by being caressed. So it's a very pleasurable expression. That's from Darwin's book. And that's from Jane Goodall. That's an open-mouthed kiss as Humphrey and Athena greet each other. So we can see that affection and emotions are certainly not just human. And this third one I put in because I just think it's so remarkable. This is a line of groomers. Greybird grooming Hugo, who grooms Flo, who grooms Fifi. That's from Jane Goodall's That's amazing. I wonder what it would be like if humans did that. Lined up and ruined each other. And this is a picture of human, this is also from Darwin, humans smiling and laughing, being very happy about something. And this is also from Darwin. This is someone in feeling horror or agony. Just very, quite expressive. And this I thought was very, very interesting. It says, Jovial and Sherry, for years they were all but inseparable. They're brothers who were just very caring about each other, which is just, there's such an affinity with humans in all of these pictures. This is contempt and disgust or disdain. The gestures and facial expressions are really, throughout this, quite remarkable. And that's an alpha male. It's all expanded, showing the erector. Quite a bit larger than the others. And I put this last one in because Jane Goodall's remark was so funny. That's one way of looking at it.
We'll look at them.
You can imagine a human infant doing that, playing around like that, actually. Okay. Thank you.
Let's have the lights on.
Thank you all. Do you have any questions or comments? Anything? Yes.
I don't know if somebody
Jim.
else to. Jim.
Put your microphone back on, Maxine.
Oh, yes.
She, this for you, she has it.
Okay. That was wonderful. And I hesitate to ask a question, but what can you share with us about the origins of autocratic dominance and in your travels?
I can't quite hear. What can I share with you about?
The origins of autocratic dominance. And in your travels, have you found any evidence of autocratic dominance in females?
No, I should mention too that when Darwin talks about autocratic males, what he talks about across species is the law of battle, which has to do with reproduction. It doesn't have to do with actual fighting, competition, what has become male-male competition, which is more like what it is today. But that's really a human elaboration of what originated in terms of evolution simply as a competition for reproduction, access to females and female choice, etc. So what humans have done really in terms of that is just increase the, in all kinds of technological ways that are really quite hazardous and violent. But I have mentioned Amazons, and I know that my son Kevin was reminding me of Elizabeth I, who was aggressive. And there are women who are aggressive, certainly. But I don't think to the extent that males are. And the competition between males, I think, starts early in puberty, where there's competition. And that may be tied very definitely to, as a kind of beginning way of attracting females. But I don't do that kind of research.
That's right.
Early on, you reminded me of a riddle I was asked by my sister. And the answer has changed over the many years I've asked this riddle. I like it because it has the word smirk in it. How many jokes do you know that have smirk?
I like it because it has a smirk.
This is the riddle. What do you call a smirking felon who's going downstairs? And the answer is a condescending condescending. However, lately I asked this riddle of, well, women specifically respond immediately, Trump. When I ask this of men, I've learned not to ask them this riddle. They dance all around it, but they won't say Trump. And some of them, at the end of their dance, where we both know what they're trying to say, they treat me very differently as a female person, and suddenly I am some sort of a threat.
Of a threat.
A threat. Not all men, but I find very many are uncomfortable. But what is lovely, I asked this of a lady, I told her the joke, she laughed. And then we looked at each other and I said, sometimes I get, and she said, Trump, yeah.
I think this gentleman had a question
Yeah.
right there.
As- On that note, the beginning of the ring cycle, first thing Votan does is cheat his contractors. Causes all the problems later.
All that you've shared with us today has been very insightful and interesting. I noticed in your comments, the focus seemed to be on
Can you
physical.
make that louder? I'm having a little...
Oh, so in your comments today, the focus seems to be on muscular, physical reaction or observation. But I'm curious, you haven't said much about sound or language as it might relate to emotions and what happens when people are experiencing emotions. Can you comment about why the issues of sound or language aren't a part of what you were discussing today?
Your question has to do with not recognizing language as part of the emotional
Yeah.
reaction. Yeah. I'm not avoiding language at all. I just think that the way in which we grow up from infancy onward motivates us to express ourselves in gestures and certainly also in sound, in terms of crying or laughing or whatever it is, or just making sounds. But I think until we actually begin learning language and become adept at speaking, I think what happens actually is that we let language take over, and then we don't pay as much attention to how people are moving. And whether my dance background has influenced me to think that there's just a lot more going on movement-wise, even in a subdued way. When we talk, we tend to just not exactly forget, but just don't pay attention to the movements. Oh, I was really angry. Well, you're not interested in my expression of it. I was really angry. Well, I don't know. Or, oh, that was wonderful. I mean, there are all of these gestures that are, there's a greater expression, and it's not that I distrust language, but I think that it tends to subdue an awareness of movement.
Thank you.
And the movement is really critical.
Maxine, I want to ask a theoretical and practical question. Theoretically, do you think it's possible to have an emotion for which you, no matter how hard you try, you can't find the trace for the source of why you have that emotion? And practically, can you talk about the situations where it's very, very hard you're so shocked by your emotion that you know that therefore it's so hard to find what's lying back there. Could you talk a bit about what you think is lying behind emotions which come as a total surprise?
I want to be sure I understand you. In other words, you have an emotion that is just not, it's like overwhelming.
It's just that you don't know where it came from. I'm not saying it's overwhelming, but you don't know why you're having that emotion.
That's a good question.
Do you know some situations? Do you know some situations where you could suggest something that's hidden there which might really be there, but you don't recognize it?
That's very, very possible. I think that if that happened to me, if I say where it came from, I would want to just kind of really examine the felt sense of that emotion. What's happening in my abdomen or my legs or my fingers, etc., and just examining what's going on bodily and seeing if that gives me any clues as to where it's coming from. I mean, are you thinking that it could come from a certain situation in the past, for example?
Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of like, it can be like a reverberation in the present from something that happened in the past that kind of takes over. Yes. Yeah, that can certainly happen. Yeah. And I think as we get older, it happens more often. Any other? Yes. So back here.
You mentioned that Husserl talks about the soul pervading
Wait a
every
second.
aspect.
I have a little trouble hearing, and I still haven't been able to get these hearing aids, so go ahead again.
Edmund Husserl talks about soul pervading every aspect of the body, I think you said. I wonder if you could say more about what he meant by soul. You said psychological. How does he really, what does he think soul is? Or what's the basis of that word, that root for him?
He's really talking about the subject, what he calls the subject. And the subject is the person, the individual. He talks about the personal ego. In other words, it's not just some kind of what you would call just automatic reactionary kind of thing that's directing the body to do such and such. but it's the soul that has this gamut of feelings and thoughts and inclinations and all of these. I mean, when he talks about our talking and our walking and dancing or whatever, they're all things that are going on not just bodily and certainly not just in terms of brains, but the soul is just definitely not, as I said, a religious aspect of what he's talking about. Doesn't get into that aspect. But he does mention spirit, too, which is all of these terms that come from German I could look them up and give maybe a more precise definition of them. That's a good question.
Well, anybody else? Okay. You wanted to follow up?
Excuse me?
You have a follow-up?
Yes, well, it's not a follow-up, it's another question.
Okay. Well, maybe this should be the last one. Taking an hour.
Is it here? Okay. Maxine, I want to tell you that I have about 5 questions. I don't want to dominate, but since you said, I hope it's not the last, but let me just say before I ask the question, that I know you talked about the fact that we're going through a period now where we're too brain conscious as far as giving explanations for things. And Noam Chomsky recently said that it's impossible to do what we're doing because the brain hasn't evolved enough yet to give us the necessary evidence we would need to find out what self-consciousness is all about. I think it's a profound profound question. What I want to ask you is, do you think that altruism is biologically based?
Whether altruism is
Biologically based.
Well, I think that it could be shown to be biologically based because other species, I've read in terms of a lot of animal studies of one animal helping another. For example, there's a graphic actually of a baboon, an older baboon, helping a younger baboon to cross a ledge that it would otherwise not be able to. The older baboon took him on his back and carried him over the ledge. So that's an altruistic action. And I think it very, very definitely it's part of that. In a way, the caring for children, for infants, could be altruistic because it's caring for another life, and even the example in some ways it seems to me of teachers and students saving other students from a gunman. That's altruistic, and it comes. They don't sit and think, "Oh, gee, what'll I do? Shall I do that?" I mean, it's very risky, and they risk their own lives doing that. So, I would say that it has biological roots, and definitely in terms of other species, helping others to do whatever. And sometimes I've seen 2 studies of one animal taking some kind of leaf that's supposed to be palliative in some way and putting it on the wound of another. So there are instances of that kind of altruistic behavior, I think.
So I think that's a wonderful place to pause. Okay. Let's thank Maxine once more. Continue discussion afterwards, but everybody can be feel free to go home now.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.